Journal. He was a professor in atomic and molecular physics at Utrecht University, and now he is a professor emeritus and dean of faculty of Ministry of Defense of the Netherlands. His research interests include plasma surface interactions, functionalization of surface, as well as detailed chemical reaction at surfaces. Second speaker is Dr. Viswanathan. He is a publisher within the Physics and Astronomy Journals team at Elsevier. At the same time, he is a computational materials scientist. Before joining Elsevier, he worked at TU Delft and MPIE Düsseldorf as a postdoctoral researcher. He has published and reviewed many research journal. He was a professor in atomic and molecular physics at Utrecht University, and now he is a professor emeritus and dean of faculty of Ministry of Defense of the Netherlands. His research interests include plasma surface interactions, functionalization of surface, as well as detailed chemical reaction at surfaces. Second speaker is Dr. Viswanathan. He is a publisher within the Physics and Astronomy Journals team at Elsevier. At the same time, he is a computational materials scientist. Before joining Elsevier, he worked at TU Delft and MPIE Düsseldorf as a postdoctoral researcher. He has published and reviewed many research papers for leading journals like Physical Review Letters. Before we start, I will share housekeeping rule. Please ask a question using Q&A feature in Zoom that is found at the bottom. Questions will be addressed after the presentation. Webinar will be recorded and shared with the attendees after the webinar. Materials and e-certificate will be provided by email tomorrow. Okay, and let's stop sharing. Let's get started, and I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to Henry. Henry?
Thank you very much. We'll just wait until we have it all up here. Okay, well, we're jumping straight into it. There's actually a slide before this. I'll go back and see this. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this reviewer workshop. First of all, I would like to mention that even though I am associated with applied service science, this particular reviewer workshop is not just for people in the field of applied service science, or for that matter, any other specific science. It's very broad and very general. It's all about a very important part of what we are doing, namely evaluating the manuscripts and thereby also looking at the quality of this. And in order to do that, we need reviewers. We call them reviewers. I know other people call them referees, but we prefer to call them reviewers. Let's start out with our cartoon, and it's all about the evolution of intellectual freedom. It's a very elaborate term, freedom and intellectual freedom, because what I want to say with this cartoon is actually coming from a site called PhD Comics. I would recommend that you take a look there if you are thinking about being a PhD, or maybe as a postdoc thinking about back at the time when you're a PhD, because there are many funny cartoons. Anyway, here we have the before grad school, and he says, well, I'm going to research whatever I want. And then he thinks, well, I'm going to do whatever my professor runs. And then you sort of go on and go on. And ultimately, you get to the point where I'm going to research whatever my grant committee wants, and then rest in peace, research in peace. So you go through all this, and the intellectual freedom is really determined by external factors. And one of these external factors is also about what can you actually publish? And in that respect, also how to be a reviewer. And now you're probably going to ask me, when can I become a reviewer? And typically that would be around here, in between sort of the lady and this boy here sitting with his computer. That means that you have to be an advanced graduate student. You have to have probably something like 4 or 5 or maybe even more published papers. And as you probably saw in the mentioning about Bismanat's past, he's reviewed about 3 times as many papers as he's actually written. So expect that ratio to be about 1 to 3. And I'll explain later why that is. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit about our journal and why applied service science needs so many reviewers. Our journal had until about 2019 an increase every year about 17%. As you can see, it peaked up here. And as you probably all know, COVID struck, and being in an applied service science, we need to go into laboratories often, and therefore people couldn't go into their laboratories, and then now it's decreased. As a matter of fact, now it's decreased down to about 16,500, but this year, lo and behold, we're all of a sudden getting many more submissions, and the red dot up here indicates where we expect to be in this year, about 20,500. So quite a number of submissions. Having said that, it also means that we, for each one of these submissions, needs about 2 to 3 reviewers that are willing and able to review the paper. So we need about 55 to maybe 60,000 reviewers per year. That's a lot. So that means every day we need to find quite a few reviewers. And therefore we need help from our scientific colleagues. And obviously you're here today to hear about how to do that. Unfortunately, at the same time, when these numbers have increased, at the same time, we've seen a trend that is disturbing. That is that the accept rate has been going down almost linearly, and it's in the past years stabilized at about 18-19%. That's very disturbing because it means that we actually receive about 5 times as many papers as we actually publish. Unfortunately, that's not just for our journal. It's for most major journals. They see that the rejection rates are going up dramatically because it's become more easy to submit a paper, and it's easier to choose a new journal and send it again. So having said that, let's go into the sort of various parts of people dealing in the journal. And I just want to show you our team. Unfortunately, this is from 2019. We actually had a conference this year, so we should have had a new picture, but because we were so busy, we forgot to take the picture. This was actually taken in Pisa, and it only shows parts of our team. In total, we are about 45 people working. And when I say working, I mean we all do it in our spare time, basically, because we're not employed by Elsevier. We are all doing that in next to our academic work. And that applies to all except for, of course, the publisher, Bismanat. So when we talk about the so-called stakeholders are people who have an interest in the publishing. There are many people involved in that. I'll show them here. There's the funding agency, the academic institution, that would be the university or the laboratory you work at. The authors, obviously, and the co-authors, the publisher, the editor, the reviewers, libraries, and the readers. And today I'll focus on 2 things, the authors and the co-authors, and of course, especially on the reviewers. How do we do that inside our journal? What are the various components? Our journal has a 2-layer submission system, meaning that you as an author send your paper to the journal office. And from there, it goes into a pre-screening that is done by our managing editors. We have 9 of them. They have the authority and the ability to either reject or recommend or ask you to change something if you made a mistake. But if they're satisfied, they'll send it on to the editor. And we have in total 32 editors down here. If there are some issues with in the pre-screening, it might actually end up at my desk as the editor-in-chief. And the same thing applies to the editors. If they have an issue, they'll send it back to me. And ultimately, it'll end up either being rejected or recommended to another journal, or it'll be accepted. And down here it says 25 to 30%. Well, that's what we would like to have. Unfortunately, it's only about 18%. So the question is, why do we need reviewers? Well, what is a peer review? Oh, wait a second. I should give it at this point. I should give it to Biswanath. I'm sorry. Biswanath, you should continue from here.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Henrik, for nicely introducing the topic of peer review. So from this point onwards, I will take you through different topics related to peer review. For instance, what is peer review process and what are the different types of peer review and what are the benefits of a peer review. So let me start with the first question, that what is peer review system? And like Henrik, I will also start with an image from PhD Comics. So what you see here is that on the left-hand side, a senior professor who has been asked to review a paper gives it to a postdoc. And then the postdoc transfers it to a PhD student. And the manuscript finally ends up on the desk of a master's student who is very confused because he doesn't have enough knowledge to judge the quality. So this is a very hilarious scenario of peer review process, but it doesn't reflect the true essence of peer review. Peer review can be defined as the evaluation of work submitted by an author to a journal by one or more people of similar competence. So however funny the above picture is, it doesn't reflect the peer review. So peer review process has to be done by people who are competent enough to judge the quality of manuscripts. Now the next question is why do we need peer review? Well, peer review is the process to assess the quality, significance, and originality of scientific research before publication. That means this process validates the scientific research by eliminating invalid or low quality publications. And of course, as Henrik previously mentioned, reviewers are the backbone of this process because reviewers go through the manuscripts and provide various suggestions to improve the manuscripts. So to summarize, peer review process improves the quality of published papers, and this process also provides credibility to the results that are published in a scientific journal. In addition to controlling the scientific quality, peer review process also limits unethical behavior by preventing publication of plagiarized work. And finally, the peer review process also ensures that most of the previous important work related to a manuscript gets duly acknowledged in the manuscript. So these are the various necessary or important points related to peer review process. Now, peer review process nowadays comes in different flavors. So depending on the need of the field or topic, or also the need of the readers of that field, different models of peer review exist nowadays. So during this presentation, I will cover some of the most important types of peer review process. So let me start with the first and the most important peer review process, which is called single blind review. So in this single blind review system, the reviewers are anonymous to the authors. On the other hand, reviewers know the details and details such as name and affiliation of the authors. Then comes the double blind review. In the double blind review, reviewers and authors are anonymous to each other. That means they don't know the identity of each other. Finally, there is open peer review system. So open peer review is a kind of a broad term under which different models exist. In the most widely used definition of open review, the authors and the reviewers know the identity of each other from the very beginning. But as I said, there are other models also exist. For instance, in a slightly different version of this definition, the review report as well as the identity of the reviewers are also published along with the main manuscript. So this is an example of peer review report that has been published for an Elsevier journal. Now, as I said, this is a very broad domain and the types of peer reviews are evolving continuously. So different journals are trying and experimenting different models of peer review. But at this moment, we can safely say that single blind review is the most widely used peer review system, and it has been used by different journals. Well, at this point, I think most of you, especially the young researchers, must be having this question, then how can you become a peer reviewer for a journal? Well, to become a peer review for a journal, you have to create a track record in a given field. And how can you do that? You can do that by building knowledge in a research field and publishing good scientific papers in that particular field. Once you do that, you also become a peer in that field. Then the second most important point is that your profile reflects your expertise and research experience. So please make sure that you build a profile which truly reflects all your scientific background and expertise in a particular field. Make sure that your email address and other contact details are up to date, because when an editor searches for a reviewer in your field of research, then the reviewer should be able to reach you. Otherwise, you will not be able to join or work as a reviewer. And finally, you should also share your expertise in different platforms like ORCID. This is very important. There are also other ways to become a reviewer. For instance, you can approach an editor of a journal directly. The editors of most of the journals go to big conferences. So if you come across an editor of a journal for which you would like to review, please approach the editor directly and show your willingness to review for that particular journal. Then you can also co-review with a colleague, or you can even request a senior colleague of yours to recommend your name to the editor of a journal for which your colleague reviews. So these are different ways in which you can become a reviewer. And finally, you can yourself also volunteer to review. For instance, Elsevier Reviewer Hub is a platform where you can register and you can show your willingness to review for a particular journal. So I will talk about Elsevier Reviewer Hub and its full potential after a few slides. But the bottom line is that to become a reviewer, you have to be visible to the right scientific community. And you can be visible in different ways by approaching an editor directly or by approaching an editor through a colleague of yours. And last but not least, you can also volunteer yourself to review for a particular journal. So this brings me to the question that why should you review, or what are the benefits of scientific reviewing? first and the foremost reason for which you should review is because of the fact that all manuscripts, including yours, that are submitted to a journal have to be reviewed. So you should review a manuscript for the same reason any other reviewer would review your manuscript. And the review activities they get proper credit from the institutions. So if you are not aware of it, please talk to your group leader or the professor of your department and show your willingness to review. Then when you review for a scientific journal, you get access to the results months before its publication. So this process often leads to new ideas, or you get access to new insights that you can use in your own research. Of course, you shouldn't copy and paste these results from the scientific or for the papers directly, but what you can do is that you can take the ideas and try to find out a way to use these ideas in your own research, but never copy and paste. Then the process of scientific reviewing also benefits your publications. How? When you read a manuscript and review a manuscript, you not only just read it, you try to find out ways in which the manuscript can be improved, and you make those suggestions to the authors. So during this process, your own thought process to write a manuscript also gets improved, and in this way, you can also write better manuscripts. The peer review process, it also allows you to mentor young researchers, because when you read the papers, you provide various suggestions to the young researchers. And in this process, your leadership quality also develops. So at the end, this will help you to become a better leader in an academic world or in an industrial role in future. There are few more benefits of becoming a reviewer. So, for instance, when you review for a journal, you come in contact with the editors of that particular journal. So, this kind of contact with the editors may lead to a position where you can be a part of editorial board and work closely with the editors of a journal. So, at this moment, I am working with the editors of some of the journals that are under my portfolio, and we are trying to find out the most active reviewers, and we are trying to find a way to incorporate them in the editorial board of these journals. So if you review for a journal for a long time, and if you are very active, you may end up in the editorial board of a journal. And last but not least, you get a certificate for your reviewer activities. So this is a certificate that I obtained for my reviewing activities for an Elsevier journal, which is Journal of Alloys and Compounds. And you can share such a certificate in different platforms like LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. And there you can build your own network by sharing your activities related to reviewing. Now, as I mentioned few slides before, I would like to take you through the different options that are there in the Reviewer Hub. So, Reviewer Hub is a platform that has been developed by Elsevier for reviewer engagement. So, within this Reviewer Hub platform, you can build and manage your entire reviewer profile for Elsevier journals. For instance, on this side, right-hand side, you can see this button here shows invitation. That means you can check all your invitations that you have received for an Elsevier journal, or the reviewers or the reviewing activities that are in progress at this moment. And you can also see the past review activities that you have done for the Elsevier journal. So in short, you can see all your reviewing activities in this journal, in this Reviewer Hub platform. So this Review Hub platform is also very important for young researchers who want to volunteer to review, because here you see this option, volunteer to review. So you can go there and you can register and show your willingness to review for a particular journal. So this is a great place to begin for new researchers. When you review for an Elsevier journal, you get 30 days complimentary access to Science Direct and Scopus. So you can enable your claim to complimentary access of Science Direct and Scopus also in the Reviewer Hub. And finally, you can also download your Reviewer Recognition Certificate, which I showed in the previous slide, also from Reviewer Hub. Actually, you can get access to all your reviewing activities and the certificates from this platform. So this is a snapshot of my reviewing activities that I have done for the Elsevier journals in the past. And you can see that for all my activities to different journals, I have a certificate associated with it. So to summarize, this is a perfect platform to build and manage your reviewer profile. So if you review for an Elsevier journal, or if you are willing to review for an Elsevier journal in future, I would strongly encourage you to make a profile in Reviewer Hub so that you can manage all your activities in this Reviewer Hub platform. So with this, I will hand over the presentation now to Henrik, who will take you through the different stages of scientific peer reviewing.
Okay, I'm back, and I probably have the ability now to, I don't see the presentation anymore.
Sorry, Henrik, I made a slight mistake.
Okay, just a household thing. Betty mentioned at the very beginning that we would like to use the Q&A for questions. So I noticed that there's a lot of comments from various people and telling us where you are. That's very nice to know, and obviously we'll keep that. But I would like to ask you to refrain from putting too many comments in there, because we need the Q&A session to be clean so we can answer the questions. We have reserved about 45 minutes for the questions, and obviously if there are many more that we can't answer, then we'll do that, probably summarizing pertinent questions. So now you've heard a lot about the benefits of being a reviewer, and probably at this point you would like to ask me as an editor-in-chief, so does that give me any benefit with the journal if I submit a paper? Yes and no. It gives you the benefit that we know you, that we probably trust you at this point, but it doesn't give you any other benefits in terms of that the likelihood that your paper, if it's not good, will be accepted more readily than any other people. So there's no benefit in that respect, but obviously if we know you and we trust you, we also trust that you're a good scientist and that the paper you submit is a good piece of science. So now we'll go to the point where you have become a reviewer. It could be the very first time you become a reviewer, and we start by step 0. You receive an invitation. Now, at this point, when you've received your invitation, you should look at the abstract and preferably the whole manuscript, if it's available. It's not always the case. And then you should ask yourself, am I really a peer? And a peer is someone who is equivalent, able to judge the work. So look at the subject area, look at the content of the paper, at least the abstract, and ask yourself, am I truly a peer? And secondly, and very important, of course, for yourself, but also for the editor, is you should ask yourself, will I be able to review the paper in time before the deadline given by the editor? And if the answer to that, then you should ask yourself, will I be able to give an unbiased opinion of the paper? That's also very important. Unbiased means that you don't have any preference. It's not something you know very well, etc., etc. And having said that, you should ask yourself, do I have any conflicts of interest with the paper? For instance, there are competing submissions. I have a similar submission. And if you do have that at the same time, you probably should say, I don't want to review this paper because I have a competing submission. And if the answer to the first 3 is yes and no for the last one, then you should accept the invitation. But once again, very importantly, can you review the paper in time before the deadline given by the editor? Now you start with the actual review. And what you start is, and before we start with this, I should probably answer the question that you probably have. How long does it take to review a paper? And I normally say a week. And then you would say, a week? I don't have a week to review the paper. No, the process starts maybe on Monday. You read the paper, maybe you spend an hour and a half on it, and then maybe on Tuesday or Wednesday, you go back to the paper, you redo it, and then et cetera, et cetera. And by Friday, you'll be able to submit your review. So you look at the general impression in the abstract, looked at the manuscript as a whole. What is your general impression of the manuscript? The language, the style, the grammar, the structure. And of course, would you have liked to read this paper if the paper had been published? And would you maybe even refer to this paper? A very important part is the abstract included, and is it truly a summary of the paper? And once again, is the paper too long? Because journals have set limits for the size of various submissions and number of words. In reality, that will never be a question for you to answer, because the journal editors themselves should have done that before they submitted the paper to you. They should have looked at whether it's too long. So now you go through the paper like you would when you write the paper. Having said that, you look at the paper from the introduction. Is it clear, effective, and well organized? And does it really introduce the subject area that the paper is about? You might have ended up accepting a paper because you thought it was about one thing, and once you start reading the paper more carefully, you realize that the title and the abstract didn't reflect really what was the subject of the paper. If that is the case, and you find at that point, I'm not really no longer a peer, I don't know this field, you should send back to the editor saying, you know, I was misguided by the title and the abstract, and unfortunately I'm not able to review this paper, but you should know that the title and the abstract is not really what is in the paper. You can start then writing your feedback. You know, start writing, you know, in a Word file, you know, what is the kind of feedback you want to do, and be specific. And try to be nice. Don't use abusive words. Don't tell that these people are stupid or these people don't know what they're talking about. And please do not just write, the authors have done a poor job, because an editor can't use that for anything. They need to know what you think is wrong with it. You have to realize that most journals obviously have editors who are senior. They have worked a long time in the field that they are working on, but obviously we don't know everything either. So we need these highly qualified people to help us, but if they're not specific, we can't use the review. Then we go on to the methodology, and a very important part of that is, can a colleague reproduce the experiment? So if I ask my colleague, would you be able to do this? Can you understand the methodology? Do you understand what the instruments they've used, maybe the chemicals, or how they have done it? And did they actually show the references to other things, other papers? If the paper, they are not selling everything themselves, they are referring to others, then is it good enough for reproducing that? And obviously, if you're working in a science where the number of samples can be small, it can be a very difficult experiment, is the sample size large enough, and was it selected in an appropriate way? Once again, another question is, should the authors have included other supplementary material? Most journals these days give you the option to either deposit the raw data or show more data than you actually want in the paper. That's a very good suggestion, to have supplementary data added to it so you can actually support the claims you make in your paper. Then we go on to the results and discussion. And once again, suggest improvements if necessary in the way the data is shown. That could be the graphs, it could be even the fonts, it could even be the size of the graphs, or maybe you need more contrast or what have you. But it can be many, many things. It could also be that you shouldn't use this kind of a diagram because it's misleading. And you should talk about their justifications and whether you find them convincing enough as a paper. And obviously, you should also talk about the number of figures, how many figures have they included, the tables and the schemes, because sometimes you will get way too many figures and way too little explanation to understand these figures. And when you write your comments, once again, be specific, preferably with a page or line number. You could, if you're able to, also edit the PDF file, because most journals will provide you with a PDF file, and then send that back to the editor, and maybe even asking the editor to provide that to the authors. Obviously, in this case, if it's a single blind review, as we do in Applied Service Science, don't put your own name in the file itself, because it will be revealed to that. Also, do not ask the authors to include a lot of your own papers as a reference. It's, first of all, not good ethics. And secondly, it's just plain stupid, because you will reveal your own name. So it's not a way to get paid for being a reviewer, having the authors forced to refer to your papers. If there are big grammar mistakes or any other mistakes, you should also list them, and for that matter, all other changes separately. And if you think it would be necessary in order to have the paper published, you could suggest additional experiments or analysis. And at the very end, you should ask yourself whether this manuscript is worth being published. Don't be too harsh on the authors, because once again, today you're a reviewer, tomorrow you're the author. And you would like to be treated as an author well by the journal, and therefore you should also treat the authors well as a reviewer. And in the conclusion, you should look at the claims and whether they're justified or not. And if not, tell the authors to either justify them better or to tone them down, meaning not making these claims. And if there is a lot of redundancies in the paper, ask them to reduce it. It might sound crazy, but it sometimes takes more time to write a short paper than it takes to write a long paper, because you have to be more concise. And make sure that the abstract is the place where you summarize the study and not necessarily the conclusion. All the references, tables, and figures, try to check them as well as possible. Comment on the tables and figures, the quality. Comment if there's any footnotes. It's not used as much as it is. And once again, as I said, do not suggest your own papers as a reference unless there is one that absolutely needs to be a reference. The reviewer will be given the opportunity to say that, but the editor will most likely check it. And if he or she thinks that it's not necessary, he has the authority to delete that in it. Now, as a reviewer, you have various tools. First of all, you have free access to Science Direct. That means it's all content published by Elsevier. And obviously, the way we do reviewers and the facilities that Elsevier provides, and when I say we, I'm not employed by Elsevier, but the company Elsevier, it's no different from any other journal or any other publisher. So it's very much the same, except obviously they don't have Science Direct, but they have some other facility they probably will provide you with. You have free access to Scopus, which is a large abstract and citation database. And there is a reference linking and resolution in the PDF of the manuscript. If the computer is able to decipher the references, then the references will be linked in the PDF, and you can actually click on them and go on to. For the editors, we have the same facilities as the reviewers, but we also have a plagiarism detection tool, and we have various tools based on Scopus database to identify potential reviewers, or even in our own database. And our own database for applied surface science contains about 70,000 potential reviewers. So although it sounds like a huge number, first of all, many are too busy at the moment we invite them. So we typically have to invite somewhere between 3 to 5 reviewers to get 2 reviews back. So if you look at the linked review, linked references, you will see that you can basically click through them, and then you end up, if the paper is in Elsevier, you'll end up through your access to Scopus, you'll end up with the paper. If you have it through your institution, you'll end up at the paper. So you can actually check and see whether the paper makes any sense to have as a reference. So now you might ask me, what do I think is a good reviewer? And for me, it's very important that you provide an objective, thorough, and comprehensive report. That's point 1. Provides well-founded comments for the authors in a polite manner and gives constructive criticism. So don't just tell people this is wrong. Tell them, I believe this to be wrong. I think you should have done it this and this way. You can, besides the recommendation you give to the authors, you can also give a recommendation to the editor. The author will not see that. So you have the ability to make a comment to the editor. For instance, you can say, well, you know, I've seen the same paper submitted to a different journal. I don't know whether it got published, but it could be that they're actually trying to submit the same paper to the same journal at the same time. Submit the report on time. If you need a few more days, ask politely to the editor, and most likely the editor will be happy if you say, okay, I need 2 more days, 3 more days, 4 more days. But don't ask the editor for 2 more months, because that's not going to happen. Because just as I said, you as a reviewer wants to be treated as you as an author, and you don't want to wait another 2 months for a review on your paper. And don't force authors to refer to their own work. Now we've talked a lot about how to do it, how to become a reviewer, and how we actually do the review. Obviously, at this point, even though in these 45 minutes, we've not been able to tell you exactly how it entails. So I strongly recommend, as Biswanath said, try to cobble into other more senior people's review. Don't let a paper get dumped on you, told you, oh, you do that, as in the cartoon that Biswanath showed. But ask them, can I join you in the review and see how they do the review? When should you do that? Well, once again, once you've published about 4 or 5, maybe 6 papers, and these 6 papers should preferably then be in one subject area and not in 6 different subject areas, because then you'll be what is called a jack of all trades, meaning you know a lot about, you know a little about many things and not a lot about a single thing. So on these links up here, you will be able to find further reading for a reviewer, but also as an author, as an editor. So you can understand the publishing process with Elsevier. It's not really different than any other publisher. As a matter of fact, many publishers use almost the same interface. And so if you know one journal, you pretty much know the other journals. And as Biswanath said, one thing I would like to mention is you can get notified. So you can promote just only yourself as a person, but also your articles and your research. And I know that some journals give you a voucher to do your review work, but most journals do not provide you any benefits except for the access to various sources at the companies. And why is that? Well, it has to do with the fact that if someone gives you a voucher to review for a journal, it also means that you're basically forced to submit your next paper to that journal, because obviously you have this voucher and you need to use it. Elsevier doesn't do that, as far as I know. At least we don't do it in Applied Service Science. We do support open access, but it's not a fully open access journal. It's a hybrid journal. I would suggest you also go to the Research Academy, .elsevier.com. There you'll see about how to become writing, the publication process, as I briefly mentioned, and how you can go through the peer review. Also, how should I do as an author when I receive a peer review back. Now, at this point, I would like to thank you. I'd like to thank, obviously, the Korean office for helping us setting this up. And I would like to thank you as an audience to do this. And we now go into the Q&A session. So I suggest that you preferably only use the Q&A session for the questions. And the way it works is that Betty will be trying to collect the questions, and then I will read them up, and then Biswanath and I, to the best of our ability, will try to answer the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Henrik, and thank you, Biswanath. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Yeah, as you mentioned, during the presentation, we received many questions. So yeah, we tried to pick up good questions as much as possible. Please understand, we had to pick up questions related to today's topic only. To deliver questions more clearly to speakers and audience, we will share the questions in written format through the slide. So we will keep updating the question on the slide in real time, so you can continue to post your question in Q&A feature. Henrik, the Biswanath, would you stop sharing your slide? Then we will share the questions. Okay, thank you. Okay. Sure. Okay, this is our first question. Speakers, would you please check and advise your opinion?
Henrik, I think you are muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I needed to have some coffee. It's early morning here in the Netherlands, so I needed my coffee. How do you check reviewers who subtly advise contributors to cite their past work when reviewing? As I had mentioned a number of times in my presentation, the editors should look for that and obviously check to see whether the references that they suggest are actually truly references and not just their own work that they want people to refer to. And the editors have not only the ability, but also the authority to delete that. And as a matter of fact, personally, I often write that these references have been removed because they would reveal the identity of the reviewer. We discourage that, but obviously, if you have one paper that you think that is exactly what they should mention, don't hesitate. If necessary, write to the editor in the private part of that to the editor, saying this paper is essential for their paper, and it is my own paper, but I think it's a very essential paper. Next question. Is there really any paper ended up being recommended to another journal? If so, how such a decision was arrived that the editor decided to not accept for this journal, not reject but recommend to other journal? And how did the editor identify the other journal identified for the under-reviewed paper? Should I take that also, Biswanath?
I can take this actually.
Okay.
Actually, this is a very good question because transferring of the manuscript to other journals is an important part of the Elsevier policy, and I think not only Elsevier, many publishers are following this. So we have a workflow called article transfer service in place in Elsevier now. So what we do basically with this service is that when an editor finds that a journal is that an article is not suitable for his or her journal, he recommends it to transfer, and there is a pool of journals to which this article would then be transferred. Now, this pool of journals is constructed based on the history of such rejected manuscripts from the journal. That means it means that if the editor rejects this article, what is the likelihood of this article to be submitted to another journal? So based on that information, this pool of manuscript is created, and when an editor recommends that to submit to another journal, so the paper then goes to this pool and then it is transferred to another journal. Now, how the author can decide that journal it would go if it is not accepted in the initial choice? Well, during submission, the author can rank the journal in this manuscript pool. So the authors can decide what would be his second, third, or fourth choice from this manuscript pool. So that's how the transfer system works. Would you like to add anything, Hendrik, to this?
Well, the only thing I could add to this is that first of all, this is maybe not necessarily associated with the reviewer workshop as much as the editorial workflow for a paper. But it happens that people submit a paper that is not suitable for a journal. It happens actually quite often. And we try as best as possible to find then the most suitable journal to suggest to you. And as Biswanath explained, there are more people involved in this. And obviously, you as an author always have the final authority to say, I want to submit it to this journal or that journal. So it's you as an author who decides. Next question. Betty or Mira, could we have the next question, please? Okay. While we're waiting for the next question, then maybe I should mention that a publisher like Elsevier has in excess of 2,000 journals. So there is always plenty of journals to choose from, and many journals have a lot of overlap, and they have a slightly different scope. And it's very important not to just go for the highest impact journal, but you should go for the journal with the right scope for your paper, because even though you might get your paper published in a very high impact journal, if you get no references to your paper, then it's not worth much anyway. What is the main criteria for the selection of a peer reviewer? The criteria is that we expect you to be a peer in the area, meaning that you will be able to help us with the review of the papers. And having said that, that means that we think that you have a status, that you have published enough to do so. And secondly, that you will also be able to do it in a fair and objective manner. And obviously, we basically rank our reviewers, meaning we can actually give a number to the quality of a review. And that's all tallied up. That's all counted up. And by that, we know whether it's a good reviewer. So a good reviewer is not necessarily someone who's reviewed 20 papers for one journal in 1 year. No, it would be, I would prefer to have 4 very good reviews than 20 poor reviews. Next question, please. Will the job scope of a journal is general across the different field of research? I'm in social science. I believe what you're saying is the scope of a journal, can it be very general? I'll give that to Biswanath.
Jobs of a reviewer is general across different the scope of a reviewer is general across the different okay, each journal has its own scope, and depending on that the reviewers are chosen. So that means what Henrik just mentioned, that to become a reviewer, you need to be an expert in that particular field and you have to build a knowledge in that particular field. Now, if you are in social science, so that means you have your expertise in that particular domain or field, and then it is very much likely that you will end up reviewing for a journal in that particular domain. And it is very unlikely that your expertise would help you to get invited or get invitation from reviewing for a journal with say physics background or chemistry background. So how it works is that your expertise determines which journal you would be eventually reviewing.
Right.
I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, so there are journals that are very, very broad, but there are very few journals that are so broad that they would include, say, physics, chemistry, geography, and social science. But there are very broad journals. Our journal in particular is not that broad, but broad enough that we have many submissions. Next question, please. Okay, sometimes I have not enough time to review a paper. After accepting, can I ask for extra time to complete the review? Yes, as I explained in my presentation, if you ask for a few more days and you promise and you sound sincere, you will be given a few more days, but you will never be given a month or 2 months extra to review the paper. But once again, we would much rather have a good review than a sloppy review on time. Next question, please. If it is an open review, won't it create a platform for the authors to interact with the reviewer or influence for their favor and vice versa? Won't it affect the original review process? Biswanath?
Yeah, that's a good question actually. And the different review system that we covered during the process has their own advantages and disadvantages. And this is one of the disadvantages that you have mentioned. It can happen that the authors would try to influence the reviewer. That can happen. I mean, it's very much likely. It's after all human nature. But then the benefit is that the whole process would be open, and openness is very much needed in the modern science. So I mean, if we are looking for open review system where where referees and authors can interact and collaborate and everything is open, then everyone has to be responsible for that. So that means both the authors and the reviewers have to behave in a responsible manner so that we can get the best out of this system. So that's how it would work. But there is, of course, a danger associated with it.
Well, if I can add one thing, obviously, if you have totally open reviews, people will tend to be more polite. So that's another benefit of that. But once again, as Biswanath said, every system has its advantages and disadvantages. We just so happen to choose to go for the single blind review. But, you know, there are many suggestions for that. There's actually even people working on a system where reviewers can actually collaborate. So they will see during their review, they will see their comments before they even submit the first review. And many journals will, when they receive the revision, they will actually send back the review reports of the other reviewers to all reviewers involved, so they can actually cross-benefit from their reviews. Next question, please. Oh, very long one. In what way the peer review of a reviewer is judged for its quality? Is it based on speed of review, technical content of the review, number of comments by the reviewer? Reviewer requires recognition not only by e-certificate, but needs some other driving force to improve the quality of review. I recommend yearly awards with reward, simple honorarium for the reviewers who qualified some guidelines and meet the targets set by the journal. What do you say? Well, to start with the last part of it, the honorarium, well, first of all, it would not be my money to give away, so we don't do that. As Biswanath mentioned, we are all thinking about ways to give feedback, not just to the authors, but also to the reviewers. We do that sporadically, but you have to realize we're also doing it in our spare time, so we have limited time. But you will implicitly see a reflection on your review and the quality of your review in the way the editor handles the manuscript. So if you say reject, and the editor decides to ultimately accept the paper, then it's probably because he or she does not feel that your review was to the point. There are the e-certificates, but as I said, there is also a grade that we could give. It's not often done, I have to admit, because we simply don't have the time, but we could give grades to the review, just like you as a reviewer in our journal can give a grade to the paper, which goes from 0 to 100. We have found, unfortunately, that it's very binary, very black and white. People either say 10 or 100. So it's not very helpful in that respect. And we really look at the review as a total. And as I said, just like a paper, it's the total overview of the review that determines the quality of the review. And we often, as editors, try to look at the review from the point of an author. Will it help the author to make a paper good enough to be accepted? Because we all want the same thing. It's all in the benefit of the journal, the authors, and for that matter, also the reviewers, to have the paper accepted ultimately. Next question, please. Can editor ask for new third reviewer after the resubmission of the edited manuscript based on 2 reviewers that gave minor correction? Well, I will give this to Biswanath, but you could say editor or even the author could ask for a third reviewer. Biswanath?
Yeah, this can always happen actually. So if the editor feels that the reviewer reports are not like appropriate or does not provide enough information to judge the quality of the manuscript, then the editor can always look for a third option in that case. And there are also scenarios like when the 2 reports from 2 reviewers, they are contradictory. In that case, the editor can also seek opinion of a third reviewer to reach a decision. So there are many situations where when an editor can seek an opinion outside the 2 initial reviewers.
Next question, please.
Next question.
Hi, indeed informative. Thank you. Question is, do a reviewer need to test the methodology by running some experiments? That means having some software, same software and apparatus for that matter. Is that the case? Well, as a matter of fact, in about 2 hours' time, I'll have to talk to some scientists that are suggesting that a system is being set up to actually repeat experiments suggested by authors to test to see whether it works. But most often, you yourself will be too busy trying to do your own experiments than to repeat other people's experiment. Obviously, if you have the facilities and you're interested enough, yes, you're more than welcome to do that. But it should not go from the time that you think you need to review the paper. And as a matter of fact, one of the most difficult things to get accepted is a paper repeating another experiment. It's a totally different discussion, but if you repeat another experiment, you get a totally different answer. It's rather tough to get that accepted, but it's a very interesting concept, namely that you're not able to reproduce the data. And what you have to assess is the likelihood of you being able to repeat the experiments based on what people have shown in the paper. Next question, please. How to ensure the quality of a review? I think the comic often reflects reality. Isbanath.
Yeah. This is, again, there is, I agree that it happens in reality, but then there is no well-defined rule to ensure that the quality of the review is perfect. We are all working on ways to improve the review. Now, as one of the previous questions was asked that if editor can look for a new reviewer if the initial two reports from the two reviewers are just suggest minor revision. So in such situations, the editor can look for a third review. And also based on the experience of the editors, because all our editors are very experienced in a particular field, so they are qualified enough to judge the report of the reviewers. So based on that, they can also mention something to the authors. But saying this, of course, I mean, we cannot ensure or we cannot decide how a particular reviewer would prepare his report. So it's also to some extent the moral responsibility of a reviewer to write the report with full honesty as suggested by Henrik in his presentation. So we are to a large extent depend on the willingness of a reviewer to review the manuscript with full honesty and clarity.
If I can add one thing, when I invite a reviewer, I expect he or she is the final responsible for this review report. And obviously, it's perfectly legitimate for them to ask for help from people in their group if they're a more senior person. But I strongly discourage senior people to let the review job go down the chain inside the group. I would much rather have that the senior person, and maybe you can't tell, but I'm the more senior person, that he or she says, no, I don't have the time at this moment, but one of my colleagues, younger colleagues, is very capable of doing this, and I think he or she would be willing to do so. So please invite them. And that would be much preferable for two reasons. First of all, we get another name in the database. We get another new potential aspiring reviewer. And it helps us generally because they are often more specialized in a slightly different way than the more senior person. Next question, please. providing authors' names and affiliation during review invitation is necessary. Knowing and unknowingly mind may become biased with little favor. What is your thoughts on this? Well, that's the discussion about the blind, the double blind, and so we have single blind, meaning that the reviewer will know the names and the affiliation of the authors, and the authors don't know the names and affiliation of the reviewers. Obviously, you could go into a double-blind system. The disadvantage of that is that the reviewers will try to guess anyway where the authors are from. You can often see that by the references they show, or the way they describe their experiments and their experimental equipment. So in order to just save the reviewers all this guesswork, because I know a lot of authors will also try to guess the reviewer. And I always tell authors, don't even try, because you would never guess how crazy I was when I chose the reviewer, because you don't know this person. So yes, it could be. And one thing I should like to mention is that if you ever, as an author, or for that matter, as a reviewer, have the idea that there is a bias against where you're from, what country, what affiliation, what have you, please let the editor know, because we all try to be as unbiased as we can be. We should never let the affiliation or the ethnicity or the country that someone is coming from play a role in how we judge a paper. As a matter of fact, at least for our journal, I can obviously only speak for this journal. As a matter of fact, I'm also editor for a different journal, but for these journals, we welcome papers from anywhere in the world, and we hope to have papers from everywhere in the world. Next question, please. Is it allowed ethical for reviewer to ask the author to include or cite publications by the reviewer in the manuscript she is reviewing? Bismanath, you're muted.
Now I need a coffee. Yeah. I think this question has already been discussed during the presentation. It depends whether that paper is or the publication is really needed to be cited in the manuscript. If so, just give me a minute. So by if that manuscript is essential and is one of the or reflects a significant development related to that part of the work, then that is not unethical. It is completely fine to suggest that manuscript. But then there are cases where, I mean, I think Henrik has also come across such cases when reviewers suggest 5 or up to 10 papers, 10 of his own papers, and that is not acceptable. So try to limit the self-citation as much as possible, and it is only allowed to do when it is absolutely necessary.
Next question, please.
Yes.
I have created my profile in Elsevier Reviewer Hub. I have good publication record. However, I'm not receiving review invitations. Well, as Bismanath mentioned, there are other ways of approaching editors, either through meeting them at a conference, because you will always find editors at a conference from one journal or another. So approach them and say, you know, I'm in the Elsevier profile, but I'm not being invited. Secondly, you know, approach them directly by email saying, you know, I've done this and this and this. I've done the training for it's very important that you do the training for the reviewer training. And you can show that and show the publications you've done, and then approach the editors directly. And they will then include you into the database. And then it's very important that you, in your own profile, put all the good keywords that you do in science. So don't use very broad ones. So if you're in social science, don't just say social science. No, it could be, a particular type of social science, social media or whatever, something. And that also applies to physics or chemistry or whatever. Be very specific in the subject areas and mention as many as possible, but only the ones where you can be considered to be a peer in. So it's all a matter of showing the interest, and you can do that to the editors directly. But make sure that you direct it to the right editor and direct it to the right journal. Don't write to the editor of Surface Science and say Applied Surface Science, because it's two different journals. Very important. Next question, please. When is double-blind? Oh, we skipped one. When is double-blind? Oh. It doesn't want to be shown.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, when it's double-blind review, this is the question.
Yeah, is there a trend from single-blind to double-blind review? Biswanath?
There are, this double-blind review system, as far as I know, it's still in experimental stage, and it's tried to see if this double-blind review system improves the quality of reviewing. For instance, as there were questions that when in a single-blind review, there were situations where a reviewer may take advantage of the anonymity, and for this this double-blind reviewer system was introduced so that the authors and reviewers remain anonymous. But again, this has its own challenges. For instance, it's very difficult to maintain the anonymity. So I would say that it's still in an experimental stage to be used in different journals. But of course, the main idea behind the double-blind review is to eliminate the discrimination based on country or group or anything, or gender, for instance. So that's it's the main purpose to have the double-blind review.
I think the trend is actually going more and more towards the either opened or joint review. But once again, there are many tries in this.
Yeah.
One thing I should mention is that as a reviewer, you should never, ever, ever contact the authors directly. Never. If you have any questions to the authors, ask them through the reviewers. It's unethical for you as a reviewer to directly contact the authors before the final decision has been taken on the paper. Once the final decision has been taken, or if you ask permission from the editor, it's perfectly okay for you to contact them, and it's perfectly okay for the editor that the authors know that you are the reviewer, but don't do that during the review process before the final decision, and that being accept, reject, or recommend to other journal, but do not contact the authors in the meantime. Next question, please. As a reviewer, if see a lot of self-citations by the authors and the citations are very relevant to the work being reviewed, should it be a matter of concern? Should this be reported to the editor? Anything that you observe that you think is of relevance to the editor to know, you should mention that. And you could say that, well, this is a well-known group. They're showing a lot of references to their own papers. It's probably okay, but I would like you to take a look at it. But it could also be that you, based on that they are citing so many of their own papers, come to the conclusion that this paper does not have a lot of new things in it because they have published so many papers that are so similar that if you read one, you know them all. And that's what we call small incremental results. Don't get tempted as an author to submit a lot of these papers where you take basically one piece of good work and submit two papers instead of one paper. obviously, as a PhD student, it's very tempting because you would have 2 papers, and that would look good in your thesis. But in the long run, you'll be worse off because probably none of the 2 papers, or many more papers, will get referenced by other authors. One good paper is often to be preferred than 2 or 3 not so good papers. Next question, please. And this is a simple question. That's good to know. Please, what happens to the list of recommended reviewers often required during the manuscript submission process? Are the recommended personnel always contacted? You want to take that, Biswanath, or should I take it?
You can take it because
I'll
you are
take
the
it.
editor.
Okay.
So.
The answer to that is you most likely will never contact all of them. You might contact 1, maybe at the most 2. But it's very important that you include these suggested reviewers. Why is that? That's also to show the editor that I know my field. I know who is a potential good reviewer, and make sure that this person is still alive, is still active in the field, and is not the most well-known person in the field, because then it's an obvious suggestion for a reviewer. But this person will most likely never, ever review your paper. Okay, so it should be good reviewer suggestions. It should not be someone you've been working with recently. And when I say recently, in the past 5 years. It should not be someone you are related to. It should not be someone who is from the same institute as you. And for smaller countries, I come from the Netherlands, so it's a small country. Preferably don't choose someone from your own country. Obviously, if you're from India, China, or any other big countries, the United States, what have you, Germany, that's okay. But don't include 3 of them from the same country. So yes, they are sometimes contacted, but not all of them. But it's very important also to show the editor through the recommendations, I know my field and I know who would be a good reviewer. Next question, please. Can one write directly to the editor of a journal to express your interest to be a reviewer? Biswanath.
Yeah, yeah, I think you can do. I mean, you can get in touch with the editor of a journal to show your willingness to review for the journal. As I said, I mean, if you can come across the editors during conferences, during meetings, you can directly contact the editor and show your willingness and also explain why you are competent enough to review for their journal. So this is definitely possible.
Next question, please. How I could be a reviewer in high-impact journal in Elsevier, though I reviewed IEEE high-impact journals relating to materials and devices. I also published in Nano Energy and Renewable and Sustainable Energy Review, but I have not been asked to review such journals. Okay, we could have a whole discussion about what you mean by high-impact journals. We have various metrics to measure that. We call it impact factor and we call it side score. They're related but not the same. But there are many other ways of defining that. If you find it's a high impact journal that you personally find is very important, I would suggest once again, as we just talked about a second ago, contact the editor, but don't contact 10 editors within a short while because you might end up with 10 different review invitations. So, you know, always ask to become a reviewer. Some journals are such a high impact that they tend to use, you know, very specific types of reviewers. Our journal is one of the high impact journals in our field, but we tend to use a very broad spectrum of reviewers, and each editor has their own way of choosing reviewers, and it would go too far now to explain how we do that. But we have many different facilities and to do so, or many different options to do so. And one of the best options is that you have a lot of experience in a given field, so you know people. Next question, please. The question is, if the authors have made citations to many of their own papers, and the reviewer notices should it be reported to the editor, especially if the self-citation is very relevant. Well, I guess we already answered that questions previously. So the answer to that is, as Bisman has said in that answer, is that if it's a very relevant self-citation, it should be included. Next question, please. At present, long review times are slowing research progress. How does Elsevier make sure that review duration period is reduced? Biswanath.
Yeah, this is my domain. So yeah, this is genuine concern for many journals actually. So we are doing a lot of projects on this to improve the publication speed. So for instance, we are working on a project which is named Speed Project, where we are trying to see that the managing editors or the handling editors, they try to work on the manuscripts and send it to the reviewer as soon as possible. Then the time given to the reviewers is also, we are trying to contact to the reviewers and trying to highlight them this importance of speed, and we are trying to get the review reports from the referees or reviewers as soon as possible. Then there are other aspects as well. So for instance, the authors, after reviewing the comments from the reviewers, need time to answer the questions and also restructure the manuscript in some sense, in some way. So we are also trying to work with the authors and understand what is the optimal time that the authors need to improve their manuscript and respond to the reviewers' questions. So to summarize, we are working on different aspects to speed up the procedure from the editorial point of view, from the referee's point of view, and also from the author's point of view. So we have a whole infrastructure in place, and hopefully with time, we'll see a much quicker publication in Elsevier journals.
Okay. Right. I maybe I should add one thing to this, is that it's a little bit like cooking. You can cook something very fast, but it's not very tasty. Or you can take a little bit more time, and it's a well-prepared meal, and it's a tasty meal. And that also applies to review. Personally, I prefer a review that takes a little bit longer, not weeks, but days. And have a good review rather than a poor review that is done very quickly. And you as an author deserves that. And that also applies obviously. So whenever you make a review, think of the author, how they perceive your review, okay? Because next time you will be the author and someone else will be the reviewer. Betty.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that applied surface science under Henrik is performing very good in terms of speed and quality. So it's in right hands. The journal is in right hands.
Betty, you were saying something?
Yes. Unfortunately, time is up. So I would like to close the Q&A session. Thank you very much, Henrik and Biswanath. Please, thank you so much for your insightful advice for many, many questions. And also thanks to audience for their great questions. I believe the audience now understand about reviewers' role, and then they are ready to be. I wish all of you much success in your further research career. Now
I just want to add one. I just want to add one thing. That is that this is being recorded. And last but not least, as I mentioned earlier, that we would like to maybe collect some of the questions, and if we can answer them in some way or matter, then we'll try to do that as soon as possible. Yes.